When the war in Europe finally began to collapse in late 1944, Germany's most decorated officers, men who once dined with Hitler, barked orders across frozen Russian steppes and signed their names in blood on battle maps, found themselves standing in line like cattle, stripped of power, stripped of certainty. Captured by the Allies, they expected to be locked away somewhere in ruined Europe, maybe London, maybe some cold cell in Paris. But then came the shocking order. They were being shipped to America. The rumor spread fast among the prisoners. America? Some whispered. Impossible. They will shoot us mid-ocean. The younger soldiers clung to the hope that it was a lie. But the older ones, men like General Friedrich von Broich and General Hans Adolf Preutzmann, knew better. They'd seen the war's tide turn and felt the walls closing in. By now, Germany's so-called 1,000-year Reich was barely standing on its knees. Days later, under gray Atlantic skies, those same generals were herded aboard U.S. Liberty ships. The voyage was long and silent. You could hear the creak of metal and the occasional clatter of chains. But it wasn't brutality that defined the crossing. It was confusion. American sailors, young enough to be their sons, treated them with a strange mix of professionalism and humanity. One guard even shared cigarettes with a captured German officer. "You guys drink coffee?" the sailor asked, half joking. The general just stared at him as if he'd spoken Martian. When the ships finally touched the East Coast, the Germans expected jeering crowds, maybe stones thrown, maybe soldiers with rifles ready. But instead, they saw calm. Cities still lit up at night, streets filled with people shopping, kids eating ice cream, couples laughing in cafes. It was a surreal sight for men coming from bombed-out Europe. To them, America seemed untouched, almost alien in its peace. They were loaded onto long trains, clattering westward through states they'd only seen on maps. Out the window stretched miles of farmland, cornfields rolling under wide, endless skies. The prisoners whispered amongst themselves, "This is where the enemy lives." Some of them had believed American propaganda depicted decadent chaos, racial mixing, corruption, no order. But here they saw neat fences, clean towns, and people waving at the trains. A few even smiled at the German faces staring back through the bars. General Preutzmann, a man once obsessed with Nazi racial purity, sat quietly by the window. Watching a family picnic near a riverbank, he said softly, "If this is decadence, then we've been lied to." Their journey ended in Nebraska, a vast open land where the horizon seemed to stretch forever. The train slowed, brakes squealing, as the words Fort Robinson came into view. The Germans stiffened. They expected to see snarling guards, attack dogs, barbed wire, maybe labor camps like those they had once run across Europe. Instead, nothing of the sort. A group of young American soldiers stood waiting. They weren't wearing expressions of hatred or vengeance, just plain curiosity. One, a red-haired sergeant from Kansas, gave a half-salute and said in a casual drawl, "Welcome to Nebraska, fellas. Chow's in an hour. Don't get lost." The Germans exchanged stunned looks. One colonel whispered, "They mock us." Another shook his head, "No, they simply don't hate us." As they marched into the camp, the smell of food hit them. Fresh bread, roast meat, coffee. The mess hall had long wooden tables, not cages. The guards weren't shouting orders, they were cracking jokes about baseball. It was disorienting. One German officer even muttered, "This can't be a prison." That night, as the prisoners settled into their bunks, they heard music drifting from the guard barracks, a radio playing swing tunes, and a faint voice announcing, "Bing Crosby, live from New York." For the first time in years, the Germans slept without hearing bombs or air raid sirens. The silence of America was louder than any battlefield. General von Broich wrote in his diary that night, "We have fallen into the hands of an enemy who neither tortures nor gloats. That, perhaps, is more crushing than defeat itself." Outside, a Nebraska wind whispered through the fields, and the men who once marched under the swastika lay awake, wondering, how could a country this gentle be the one that destroyed them? By the summer of 1944, something unexpected started happening across the American heartland. Small-town farmers, stretched thin by the draft, began running short on hands. Sons were off fighting in Europe or the Pacific. The fields still needed tending, wheat still needed cutting, and corn didn't care if there was a war on. That's when the U.S. government made a strange announcement. POWs can volunteer for local labor under supervision. At first, it sounded insane. Farmers were going to let German soldiers, actual enemy troops, onto their land? But across Nebraska, Texas, Iowa, and Kansas, folks didn't have much of a choice. So the first trucks rolled out from Fort Robinson one cool morning, dust rising on the gravel road. Inside the trucks sat rows of German POWs, hands on their knees, eyes alert. Most of them were officers, men who'd commanded tanks and troops, not plowed fields. But as the trucks rattled toward the countryside, something shifted. They looked out at the same land they'd crossed on the train, green fields stretching forever, barns painted red, windmills turning lazily in the wind. It didn't look like the land of an enemy. It looked like peace. The convoy stopped at a small family farm near Scottsbluff. Waiting at the gate was George Miller, a tall, sunburned man in his 40s.
wearing suspenders and a look that said he'd seen too many seasons. His wife, Evelyn, stood behind him with a pitcher of lemonade. Two little boys peeked out from behind her dress, staring wide-eyed at the prisoners in uniform. An American sergeant jumped down from the lead truck and called out, "Mr. Miller, these fellas'll help you get that wheat in. You treat 'em fair, they'll do the same." George just nodded. He'd lost his younger brother at Anzio. Every part of him wanted to hate the men standing in front of him. But as he looked at them, sunburned, thin, tired, he didn't see monsters.
He saw men. He pointed to the field and said, "All right, boys, let's get to work." The Germans didn't understand every word, but they got the tone. They rolled up their sleeves and followed. The first hours were awkward. Broken English, confused gestures, a lot of pointing and nodding. But by noon, they'd fallen into a rhythm. The Nebraska sun didn't care about politics. Sweat and dust leveled everyone. When lunchtime came, George's wife brought out sandwiches and lemonade. The guards told her, "Ma'am, you can't hand food directly to them." She looked at the sergeant and said, "Then you hand it over and tell 'em it's from me." That small act, the simple kindness of a farm wife feeding her enemies, spread faster than wildfire among the prisoners. One German corporal, barely 20, looked at his sandwich and said quietly, "Sie sind keine Tiere." They are not animals. By sunset, when the truck came to collect them, George Miller surprised everyone. He said, "You boys did good work. Tomorrow, same time?" The German translator nodded, and for the first time since capture, some of the men smiled. Back at Fort Robertson, word spread fast. The camp commander wrote in his report that local civilians display surprising friendliness toward POW workers. He didn't know it yet, but something extraordinary was happening. Enemies were starting to see each other as human again. Over the next weeks, the arrangement grew. More farmers requested POW help. Prisoners worked on ranches, picked fruit, repaired barns, even helped rebuild local fences after storms. Some families began talking to them, slowly at first, through broken English and hand gestures. The Germans were amazed. In Nazi Germany, they'd been told Americans were corrupt, lazy, and cruel. But here they were, eating cornbread and stew beside smiling farmhands who treated them better than their own officers ever had. One POW, Lieutenant Kurt Wiese, wrote in his diary, "We were taught that Americans had no soul, but today the farmer's wife offered me pie and asked if I missed home. I told her yes. She said, 'Everybody misses somebody in this war.' I will never forget that." Soon, some POWs were invited into farmhouses for meals, a direct violation of strict military rules. But folks out here weren't much for rules. They believed in decency. Evelyn Miller, that same farm wife, later said in a local interview, "If my boys were prisoners somewhere, I'd hope someone would feed them too." Inside those simple country kitchens, something began to break apart, the hard, steel walls of Nazi ideology. Over plates of roast chicken and mashed potatoes, the German generals started realizing they had been lied to their entire lives. They weren't superior. They weren't special. They were just men. Back in the camp, the senior officers, men like General von Broich and Prutzmann, watched this transformation with disbelief. Some of them tried to maintain discipline, forbidding casual talk with Americans, but even they couldn't resist the quiet power of kindness. One evening, as the sun set over the plains, von Broich stood by the fence and watched the lights flicker on in the nearby town. He turned to his adjutant and said, "They conquered us not by strength, but by spirit." And across the fields, somewhere between the golden wheat and the hum of crickets, America's greatest weapon revealed itself. Not the Sherman tank, not the B-17, but simple humanity.
By late summer, the rhythm of life between the POWs and the farmers had become strangely natural. Trucks rolled out at dawn, laughter sometimes mixed with the growl of engines, and men who once aimed rifles at each other now traded jokes with hand gestures and half-broken English. But among all those moments of quiet connection, one evening in particular became legendary at Fort Robinson. The night a group of German generals were invited to dinner by an American farm family. It started with the Anderson family, who lived on the edge of Alliance, Nebraska. John Anderson was a third-generation farmer, a big man with calloused hands and a soft heart. He'd been skeptical of the POW program at first. His oldest son, Tommy, was fighting with the 3rd Infantry Division in Italy. Every night he prayed for a letter that didn't come. So when the government sent him German prisoners to help with the harvest, his first thought was bitter. I'm supposed to feed the same kind of men who might have killed my boy? But reality has a funny way of humbling hate. The first day the POWs worked his land, they didn't complain, didn't slack off, and didn't act like conquerors. They were just quiet, respectful, and thorough, like they needed something to focus on other than the war they'd lost. Among them was a tall, silver-haired man with a rigid posture, General Erich Kretschmer, once a commander on the Eastern Front. When Anderson asked his name, the interpreter answered, "General Kretschmer." Anderson laughed dryly. "Well, General, out here you're just another farmhand." The German nodded solemnly. "Yes, and maybe that is best." After a long, hot week of work, the Andersons prepared a small harvest dinner. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, a pumpkin pie fresh from the oven. As the sun dipped low, painting the fields orange, Evelyn Anderson, John's wife,
noticed the POWs sitting by the fence, eating their rations from tin bowls. She wiped her hands on her apron, turned to her husband, and said, "John, those men worked just as hard as you. I can't eat knowing they're sitting out there with cold beans." John frowned. "Evie, they're the enemy." She looked him dead in the eye. "They're someone's sons, too." There was no arguing with her. 10 minutes later, Evelyn walked out to the fence with a basket of warm bread and waved to the sergeant guarding the POWs. "Can I bring them a few plates?" she asked. The sergeant hesitated, looked at the Germans, then at her. Finally he sighed and said, "Ma'am, technically, no, but I don't see nothing if you set it down right there." And that's how it began. One act of quiet defiance born out of empathy. The German stood, unsure what to do. Evelyn smiled and said slowly, "Eat." They hesitated, but when she nodded again, they approached like shy schoolboys. General Kretschmer, hat in hand, said softly in broken English, "Thank you, madam. You are too kind." That small exchange rippled through the camp. A week later, the Andersons did something unheard of. They sent a written request through the camp commandant. "We'd like to invite the work detail, including their commanding officers, to Sunday dinner as guests." The request climbed through military channels, causing more than a few raised eyebrows. "You want to do what?" one colonel said. But the war was ending. Discipline had softened, and Nebraska was far from the front lines. So the commander shrugged. "Hell, why not? If they behave, let the lady have her dinner." That Sunday, 2 jeeps rolled down the dusty road carrying 6 German POWs, including General Kretschmer and his adjutant. They were dressed neatly, uniforms pressed, caps in hand. The Andersons met them at the gate. Evelyn smiled like a proud hostess, while John stood awkwardly, his jaw set tight. He wasn't sure he could stomach this. Inside, the dining table was laid with fine china, the same set Evelyn only brought out for holidays. The Germans looked stunned. They had expected folding chairs in a barn, not candles and a family meal. When they sat down, silence hung heavy over the table. Finally, Evelyn broke it. "We say grace before we eat. You're welcome to join or just listen." As she bowed her head and thanked God for the harvest, for peace, and, pointedly, for every man who longs to go home safe, no matter which flag he serves, something in the Germans' faces changed. Throughout dinner, conversation came slowly, awkwardly. The Anderson kids whispered questions to their mother. "Mama, did he really fight for Hitler?" Evelyn just said, "He's here now. That's what matters." Kretschmer tried to explain in halting English that he had never been a Nazi by heart, that many officers served out of duty, not belief.
John Anderson listened, skeptical, until Kretschmer said something that hit home. "I sent boys to die because I believed it would protect my country. You sent your boy to fight because you believed it would protect yours. In the end, both our sons bled for lies told by old men." For the first time, John looked at him not as the enemy, but as a father. After dessert, the kids brought out a radio, and someone tuned in to a swing station. To everyone's surprise, one of the German officers began softly humming along to Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. Evelyn laughed. "You know that song?" The officer smiled. "It played on German radio, too, before the bombs." That night lasted longer than anyone planned. When the jeeps came to take the prisoners back, Evelyn handed each man a small paper bag. "Leftovers," she said. "No soldier should go hungry." Back in camp, the Germans sat in stunned silence. One young lieutenant said quietly, "If only Berlin could see this." General Kretschmer looked up at the Nebraska stars and whispered, "They will never believe us." The guards reported that the prisoners spoke little the next day, working quietly in the fields, but something inside them had shifted. They were no longer prisoners of war. They were men learning, painfully and beautifully, what freedom actually meant.
Word spread fast across the American heartland. What started as one family's act of compassion slowly turned into a quiet movement that no government agency had planned and no military manual had written about. From Texas to Minnesota, farmers, ranchers, and small-town folks began inviting German prisoners to eat at their tables, to sit on porches, to share stories about families they might never see again. The war was still raging across the Pacific, but here, among golden cornfields and wide skies, peace had already started to bloom. In official reports, the U.S. Army called it controlled re-education. But in truth, it was something far simpler and far stronger. It was kindness being used as a weapon the Germans had never trained for. Inside those POW camps, the American guards began to notice something strange. The men who'd arrived full of Nazi pride, who used to march stiffly and bark orders even behind barbed wire, started changing. They were humbler, quieter, even friendly. The swastika tattoos faded beneath rolled-up sleeves as prisoners borrowed English books, listened to jazz on the radio, and played baseball with the same guards who once pointed rifles at them. Intelligence officers took note. They reported that German generals, those same proud officers who once sneered at inferior Americans, now wrote in their diaries words like dignity, freedom, and decency. General Kretschmer wrote one final entry before being sent home in 1946. "I came here as an enemy, certain of my country's greatness. I leave here ashamed of that certainty, and humbled by the nation that defeated us, not with cruelty, but with character. When the war ended, most of those POWs were sent back to a Germany in ruins. But they carried something home that couldn't be bombed out or burned down. A new image of America.
They spoke about families who shared meals, farmers who offered work, and kindness that broke their chains long before they left the camps. In post-war Europe, that mattered more than most Americans ever realized. Many of those returning soldiers helped rebuild West Germany into a democracy. Some even joined efforts that would later become NATO. And deep down, they all knew why. Because they'd seen America's real strength, not in its weapons, but in its humanity. Decades later, one of those POWs, an old man now living in Hamburg, Germany, was asked by a reporter what he remembered most about the war. He smiled and said softly, "The day I was invited to dinner by an American farmer. That was the day I stopped being a Nazi." And maybe that's the quietest kind of victory there is, the kind you don't measure in miles or medals, but in hearts changed. And that was the story of how German generals, once symbols of war and arrogance, were humbled by the simple kindness of American families. Sometimes victory doesn't come from the barrel of a gun. It comes from the hand that offers you a meal. If you felt this story the way I did, if it made you proud or even just a little emotional, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me bring more hidden stories from World War II to life. Stories of courage, humanity, and hope. Thanks for listening, my friends. Until next time, keep your hearts kind, your minds curious, and remember, history isn't just about battles, it's about people.